Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our symposium on new urban imperatives, reparative and decolonial praxis. My name is Catalina Ortiz. I'm the director of the UCL Urban Lab, and I'm very happy to have with me today a set of great speakers, a great lineup of speakers that we kind of have known each other for some time with some of them. And I think for us today is absolutely relevant to be thinking on how this historic time, these historic conjunctures is also prompting us to completely change the way in which we approach urban research, but most importantly, to question our own positionality in terms of the historic moments that we are inhabiting. As you all know, the world that we live in is breaking, and whoever that doesn't have the heart broken needs to really challenge and scrutinize their own privileges. For us, cities and their inhabitants continue to endure the layered impacts of colonial, racial, structural, epistemic, and environmental violence. While reparative justice is gaining some visibility, its spatial and territorial dimensions remain elusive. But how do we engage with landscapes marked by harm? What does it mean to repair through land, memory, and collective practice? And how to engage with this question becomes absolutely relevant for the new agenda in terms of urban research, planning research, and any of the professions of the built environment. This event that we organize and put together explores these new imperatives that are emerging from this question, and therefore makes an urgent call for action and reflection that center reparative and decolonial praxis as vital responses to historical and ongoing territorial harm. We reckon with the lingering imprints of plantation logic, settler colonial urbanization, and protracted armed conflict, unraveling how these forces continue to shape the territories we inhabit. And therefore, for us, it's very important to understand how these dynamics inscribe themselves into urban landscapes, how they are co-constituting social relationships, and therefore how the different set of scholars and practitioners that are joining us today have been addressing these issues from the different territories that they inhabit. So this is a two-part gathering, one that is online, the one that are we experiencing now, and one that comes after this in person. We are going to have together scholars from Palestine, Colombia, Lebanon, Guatemala, and the United States, whose work is grounded in place-based harm and healing in different ways and with different entry points. And together we will explore how communities confront the layered violence that are enduring in different contexts, but also how to cultivate the strategies of reparation that honor memory, restore dignity, and open space for liberation. So with me today, we are co-chairing this event with Dr. Natalia Villamizar Duarte, that will pop up in the screen later. And today, the first session that we are going to have this morning, for some of you this afternoon or this night, according to where you are, is going to be focusing on the sites of harm and territorial healing. So this session engages with enduring harms produced by plantation logics, settler colonial urbanization, racialized displacement, and protracted political conflict. And the presentations that we're going to be focusing now revolve around research on the US, Guatemala, Colombia, and Palestine. The speakers will be providing some of the context and also some of the frameworks and their positionality, and so their lived experience of these processes. Presentations will be reflecting on planning, spatial design, and community memory, and how those respond to histories of anti-Black dispossession, settler encroachment, military occupation, genocide, and structural neglect. The speakers will be foregrounding Indigenous planning, reparative urbanism, and grassroots organizing as transformative practices with lived experience and relational geographies. So it's an honor for us to have here Joaquín Lopez-Huertas. He's a Mayan teacher scholar from Centajo, located in the place known as Guatemala. He's a Ph.D. candidate in city metropolitan planning at the University of Utah, with more than 10 years of working with Indigenous communities in regions in Guatemala, Chile, and the US. Joaquín's research focuses on Indigenous planning and the intersection with climate change, urban design, and land use policy through the colonial practices. Particularly, Joaquin delves into the ways Indigenous peoples restore relationship with place, foster community organizing, respond to environmental justices, and reimagine Indigenous cities. Joaquin received the Fulbright Last Power Scholarship and the GCRSC Fellowship of his doctoral studies. And before coming to Utah, where he's now based, Joaquin was a lecturer at the Universidad San Carlos de Guatemala and a OAS fellow at the University of Valparaíso in Chile. So I could introduce the rest of the speakers as they come. So I would call first to Joaquin to present his book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna share my screen if that's okay. Yes. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you so much. Sakari ki wana khel kin ja khun ka bashir tsile no bina maqin kin kiko tikin oi book utspeti kalak pa wemolin ev. Good morning everyone. My name is Joaquin Lopez, PhD candidate from the University of Utah, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this approach that I have been working over the last years that I titled Planning in Reexistence. So just to share a little bit about the context, we know that Indigenous people are constantly facing challenges as the legacy of colonization and the prevailing patterns of power that include land dispossession, territorial control. We know that through the literature that many of these aspects operate through a matrix of power, also known as coloniality. And many of these aspects operate either in material or subjective forms. I have been very interested about those subjective forms because I believe that that's where planning, urban theory, regional planning, and land policies play an important role in how they reproduce harm. So I have been focused over the last years of my research on that. And we think about coloniality or the colonial matrix of power through land policies and planning as a wall that separates Indigenous people from their livelihoods, their ways of knowing, their life. We also can understand that as a matrix and as a wall, it also might has its failures or its. I elaborated on Catherine Walsh. I would say it's the colonial cracks. So I rely a lot on decolonial theory to think about these practices as the cracks or as the spaces where Indigenous people are responding, either within, against, or beyond the coloniality of planning. So I try to focus on those spaces because it's the spaces where we can start reformulated planning, not only as a policy, but also as a practice. I want to take you specifically to Chahul, which is one of the areas that I have been working over the last years in my dissertation. So as you can see in the map on the left, I am located in Salt Lake City. The indigenous name of this place is Onkani, the place of many houses in Ute. I have been working in communities here, like including the Berkshires National Monument in southern Utah, and also in Tolakani in the Navajo Nation. Where I also observe these other practices of re-existence. But I'm going to talk a little bit about Chahul, which is very close to my hometown, Xelajuhnoc. Both of these towns are located in the Western Highlands in Guatemala, where we have the highest concentration of Indigenous people. And also, uh, well, Chahul, they are Maya Chiles, where Maya Kche, very different ways of thinking and understanding life. To show a little bit about background about Chahul, I wanted to present the picture in the right, which you can see is, as part of the legacy of colonization. We have that many of these in these cities, in these Mayan cities before colonization, we have an imposition about an urban planning theory that was important from the West, as the Leyes de Indias, for example, and the colonial checkboard, that many of these processes were funded above Mayan cities. So while we have, for example, in Chahul, the Catholic Church, we have that it was funded above Mayan ceremonial sites. This was in order to control, but also in order to guarantee that people will still come to this place. So you can see and these practices of indigeneity are still present to date, despite different processes. Of course, Many Chiles have adopted Christianity, but at the same time, it wouldn't be strange to see the Ech, which is the ceremonial guide, celebrating ceremony outside of the Catholic Church, and then they also being part of the Mass during the Sundays. And these also serve as a space of gathering, like the meeting that we see outside of the church with women exchanging seeds, corn seeds. So this is part of different demonstrations of indigeneity that we still see in towns like Chajul, with 95% of the population is as considered indigenous, and despite these other colonial layers. So I wanna cite Gaspar Pero González, a Anjobal Maya writer. He said that despite the process of colonization, we sought new strategies, kept them practicing under the clandestinity, and tricked the impostor. Over the mask of their saints, we placed the faces of our deities. Besides their calendar, we kept their path indicating our Cholch, which is one of our sacred calendars. Juxtaposed to their language is ours with its eloquence. We have learned to live this double identity for 5 centuries. So I want to show you a few examples of that, because that's where I see many manifestations of whole indigenous people planning re-existence, which is these conditions of oppressions, but this way of resignify the conditions of oppression and to move forward to redefine those futures. So in the left, we have the Cholch, which is known as the sacred calendar. It measures 260 days, 20 energies, 13 degrees in total. But the Cholch in the Mayan cosmology is not only a way to measure time, but also space. So many cities, many Mayan cities will be spatialized through the Cholch. These ways of relating with land prevail despite the colonial urban planning project that we see, for example, on the right, which this is downtown Chajul, which we know that is based on the Leyes de Indias and the colonial checkboard. So what happened in Chajul is that despite many of these new ways of defining streets, orientation, and hierarchy through the colonial urban process were implemented and defined by the Spanish, the Chiles kept their urban planning practices in some ways. And I want to show you how is that. Like, we're talking about, like, in the Catholic Church that is downtown in front of a central plaza, that was like the main altar. So that is still considered like the heart of Chajul. And then there are other manifestations that are specialized through Xolquij. For example, some of those examples are the houses built around the ceremonial site. So Xolquij, despite that it's a circle, it's also considered as a spiral. So considering the core of downtown Chajul as the church, many of these houses that we see in the left were built around the ceremonial site or around the church, adopting this colonial style construction, but maintain their archives in way within and beyond the colonial project. For instance, we see this mural in the center. These murals depict the transition in the Ixil culture from the Spanish invasion to the assimilation process. So these are kind of archives that many houses are still present and they are preserving it. Or we also have like the engraved energies of the Cholch. So what we see in this other picture in the right is a column base with the engrave of the Akpu, which is one of the 20 energies, which this will be located in front of the porches. So this will signal what would be the specialization of the Cholch and how is this become functional. In some way, spatialization in the Cholch is an embodied representation of an Ixil urban planning theory and practice. We have during the ceremony, we have, like, besides just thinking about the 20 energies, we have at the core, we have the Kushkaj and the Kushuleo, which symbolizes the heart of the sky and the heart of the land. That's where the main ceremonial altar was, and then we have the direction of the east and the west, which is the red and the black. We have the yellow in the south and the white in the north, which they symbolize directions of winds, and they will also define the orientation of the fireplaces within every house, but also the design for platforms. And even this also will entail like the movement around the city. So this will say like what would be the orientation and what would be the direction of many of the streets. So in some way, what we see here is a relationship with the space that despite the colonial project, on the understanding of the Shil community, they still have this relationship with place. And this could enter in conflict and in tension with the Western planning tools that are being implemented and enforced by the state of Guatemala that consider Western colonial planning. So these forms of knowledge that I call planning in reexistence uh, are different manifestations on how Chiles are restoring their identity, but also their politics and their relationship with place. So I started explaining about the wall and the cracks, which allows, and they serve as an epistemological lens to understand how Indigenous people weaken and operate either within, against, or beyond. And these categories are not mutually exclusive, but more about a spectrum. But the most important thing about this is how how engaging in these colonial cracks allow them to plan for the future or so re-existences. So these ways of re-existence where it's preserving the the murals or present the basis to tell these different stories or bring these knowledge systems through language, weaving, and farming practices into town and maintaining them is what define and redefine their futures in some way. So I wanted to start with that provocation and end there. But Sibalak Matiosh, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joaquin. Now we can move towards Jocelyn Poe. So I'm gonna just read a little bit of Jocelyn's bio. She's an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. Her research centers on communal trauma, spatial justice, and the development of reparative planning practices that aim to foster more equitable futures. As an educator, Dr. Poe is passionate about teaching reparative methodologies and cultivating future generations of planners who are equipped to engage in transformative justice-oriented work. Dr. Poe is the director of the Reparative Praxis Lab and the founder and principal of SAHA Planning Studio, where she integrates theory and practice to advance healing-centered planning strategies. She holds a Ph.D. in urban planning and development from the University of Southern California and a Master of Community Planning from Auburn University and a Bachelor's in Architecture from Tuskegee University. Her work has been recognized through fellowships such as the Health Policy Research Scholar Fellowship and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Spatial Futures Fellowship for Policy Link. Without further ado, Jocelyn, please take over.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me. I'm excited to talk a little bit about my reflections of trauma and repair that started in my time as a practicing planner in Mississippi. I'll never forget the day my boss handed me a flyer. On it was a caricature of a cotton plantation owner with a speech bubble that said, "Who's your master now?" At first I was confused. Why would Roy be giving me this? Then I saw the West Jackson master plan at the bottom, and I realized what was happening. You see, a group of residents had organized and distributed these flyers across the neighborhoods to warn people about the plan. We had started a planning process that was funded through HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Fund from the federal government, and initiated by a local organization who wanted to see change in the West Jackson area. West Jackson is west of downtown Jackson and a predominantly historically Black neighborhood and the home of Jackson State University, a historically Black college. So I started this plan. I was working in this neighborhood and I realized these residents were warning people about the planning process. Even though I was from the community, even though I reflected the demographics of the community, even though we used equity-based, participatory, and communicative planning strategies, and even though the process was initiated by a local organization, the plan signaled danger. The plan was a threat rooted in the very history of how the U.S. came to be. Residents weren't just warning neighbors about the planning process that had the potential to destroy their neighborhood. They were naming a link between master planning and the plantation 150 years after slavery was abolished in the U.S. In Plantation's Futures, Catherine McKintrick provided a language for this action as she theorizes how plantation logic shape the places we inhabit today. In short, Plantation Futures traces the past to the present and the present to the past through spatial processes. She argues that in colonial and post-colonial spaces, a plantation logic, not identical to slavery but carrying the characteristics of it, emerges ideologically and materially. It's a slow violence that undergirds social, political, and spatial processes. In fact, plantation logics orchestrate specific planning practices that are normalized in the U.S. and Black communities. Mississippi is no stranger to the ongoing practice of dispossession, which forces the loss of place in all its associated meaning. Confinement is an ongoing practice creating segregated cities as it boxes certain populations into the most undesirable land to spatially reinforce a racial hierarchy. Erasure happens when certain swaths of land become valuable again. Planners, naming it blighted, empty, and blank, then eliminate the life of the community there for their own gain or for the purpose of economic development. Finally, abandonment systematically stewards resources away from containment areas to further create an advantage for white groups while disadvantaging and endangering communities of color. This is why infrastructure, quality of housing stock, amenities are unevenly distributed across the city. These practices morph and contextualize to fit present-day needs. They are manipulated, reinvented, and renamed, yet they persist and carry with them the logics of the plantation. So when residents in West Jackson who have been boxed in by confinement, lived through dispossession, experienced abandonment, heard about this new planning process, they became concerned about their ability to thrive in place. So what's a planner to do? The American Planning Association, which defines and drives the field in the U.S., tasks us with creating stronger, more resilient communities. This is the definition and the role of a planner. But how do we do that when our tools and strategies are built on plantation logics? How do we create strong communities in a world that is broken? Much of my work grapples with these questions, and my answers is within the logics itself. McKintrick acknowledges that the plantation system contributed to the interlocking workings of oppression and resistance. Accompanying plantation logics are the acts of survival, resistance, creativity, and struggle against death. The flyer circulating in the West Jackson Master Plan was a creative act of survival, a way to warn the community, but it was also an act of repair. Thus, as I explore these questions of how do we create strong communities in a broken world, I turn to reparative praxis rooted in long histories of survival, resistance, and creativity. I define reparative praxis as both a consciousness and an action, a theory and a practice. It is the consciousness of care and the act of repair. It's contextual, life-affirming, power redistributing, and justice-oriented. As Knapp et al. Says, it demands radical honesty, radical remedy, and radical imagination. Across the Black geographies I've worked in, I've been exploring 3 consistent practices of repair that I want to share with you today. First, acknowledgement. The residents of West Jackson remember their history and trace the past to the present through the flyer. Acknowledgement bridges memory and action, and planners must actively engage with history through acknowledging memories as data and responding with contextual actions that lead to healing and reparations. Second is self-determination. Residents acted. They inserted themselves into the planning process to shape their own futures, not being victims of the process, but movers, activists, and actors in the process. Planners must support these types of actions, even if it means letting go or disengaging from our beloved practices and precedents that are rooted in plantation logics. The most resilient communities are those that can act on their own agency. And finally, radical imagination. Thriving requires imagining a world beyond colonial and plantation logics. It means vividly picturing freedom, healing, and planning practices unconstrained by what's gone before. This is how we realize new urban imperatives rooted in repair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. Joaquin, you raised your hand. Do you want to say something?
No, sorry, I just wanted to say an emotion about that I like it.
Indeed, we always love what Jocelyn presents. So now we are moving towards Colombia, and let me introduce my colleague, Dr. Angela Franco. She's a professor of the School of Architecture in the Universidad del Valle in Cali, Colombia, where she leads the Observatory of Contemporary Architecture and Urbanism and the research group and the Laboratory of Popular Neighborhoods, POPULAB. She's an architect, a specialist in urban planning, master in sociology and Ph.D. in architecture from the University of Cambridge. She has extensive knowledge of urban planning, social housing policies, and community participation. She has published several books, chapters, and articles. Among the recent, one of her recent books are Concealed Marginality, Free Housing Policy in Colombia, City Culture and Landscape, Informal Settlement and Upgrading with an Intersectional Approach, co-authored with Dani Ramirez. Without further ado, Angela, please join us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I will share my screen. Just let me know if it works.
Now it disappeared.
No?
No.
Okay, just a second. Okay, I think now it's working.
No, it disappeared again.
Not yet. Okay, we'll try with desktop.
I can share it for you if, okay, now it works. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for the invitation. Hi, everyone. I will talk about comprehensive habitat upgrading as a strategy for building urban territorial peace. I will be focused on the case of Colombia and projects we have been working. I will talk about why we are interested in linking comprehensive habitat upgrading and peace building, which is our claim about that topic, our work in self-built neighborhoods in Cali, the strategy we are using for doing this, and some recommendations at the end. We are in a country, in Colombia, where more than 10 million people are victims of the internal armed conflict. And this is an official number. So we know that there is sub-register on the figure. More than 9 million of these people have been internally displaced. And we have in Cali registered more than 237,000 victims of the Cali living in the city. And we were interested in working with this population, and we have undertaken extensive mapping and research projects here, and mainly in 4 neighborhoods that we'll talk later. But we found that only one in those neighborhoods, only 1 out of every 10 victims are registered in the unique registry of victims, which is the official registry of the government, and only 3 out of 10 victims in the register have been subjects of repair. We build this map with the help of, with the data of the unit of victims and the municipality of Cali. to know where the victims were living when we start our research in 2020. And we found that they were living and they were concentrated in the urban peripheries, eastern and western peripheries of the city, where the informal settlements or precarious human settlements are prevail, and where Afro-descendant communities and unemployment people prevail. So we knew that all this intersection of factors of disadvantage were sending a message of how to act, were victims from the rural areas moving to cities in low standard conditions, substandard. So our claim is that achieving urban territorial peace requires, in our case, supporting processes such as comprehensive habitat upgrading that promote a sense of belonging, identity, healing, and memory in self-built neighborhoods where vulnerable people, including victims of armed conflict and those reincorporating into society, are concentrated. So we created the Laboratory of Public Neighborhoods called Populab, Laboratorio de Barrios Populares, working on four topics: urban territorial peace, comprehensive habitat upgrading, sustainable mobility, and zero waste. And we create this as a space to think about and build the city based on community participation and the encounter of diverse knowledge, but also as a space to imagine collective social change and using new methodologies for social appropriation, knowledge, and urban peace building. We have been working since 2020, in three main projects. We finished one of these funded by the ESRC, and in which we work with UCL and Castor and Cuja in Cuba, grieving equitable urban futures in areas of transition, and City and Peace, funded by the Robert Bosch Foundation. And right now we are working on another municipality in the Pacific Coast called Guapi, with the support of the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation of Colombia. Our work since 2020 and until now has been focused in Cali, in four neighborhoods that are now recognized by the municipality as formal settlements located in the western peripheries of the city in District 18, where more than 10,000 people live. And we achieved working with this approach from combining territorial healing and reparative and transitional justice with comprehensive habitat upgrading, and working with participatory methods and an intersectional approach. And we have been developing several projects there. The main was the legal recognition of these neighborhoods as part of the neighborhoods of Cali. They were informal settlements until 2023, when we achieved the delivery of the 4 legalization decrees by the municipality. And then we have been working on the design of the 4 parks, one for each neighborhood with the community. And right now, the municipality is finishing the construction of this map of these parks, worked with the support of the community and participatory design methods. And our strategy has been using the Decalogue for slum upgrading for Latin America and the Caribbean as a community-based tool, developed by a set of institutions that formed that created this strategy during the pandemic, and we are linking this discourse of participatory slum upgrading with each of this point with the agenda of reparative and transitional justice. So for each point of the Decalogue, we work with an instrument for reparation of the victims of the armed conflict. And I want to share this discussion with you through these policy briefs we published with the Populab. this one in 2022 when the National Development Plan was in discussion. So we are trying to position this discussion about how the comprehensive habitat upgrading can become a strategy for the transition toward urban territorial peace in cities like Cali, Bogota, Medellin, where a high number of victims of the conflict have arrived looking for refugee. So this addressed the whole discussion we have in the Popular, and this other in which, well, in the last one with Catalina Ortiz, and this one with a team of the Universidad de Antioquia, Catalina, Natalia Villamizar also, have been exploring the case of Medellin. So the same discussion in another big city that received a lot of victims of the armed conflict, living in the peripheries, like a pattern that we see that it's common in Colombian capitals. One of our last works is this publication, this book about informal settlement upgrading with an intersectional approach, focusing on one of these neighborhoods we have been working with the community with the idea of discussing how different factors of disadvantage intersect, including being a victim of the armed conflict and living in a peripheral settlement. So I'm finished with this, and thank you for following us in this laboratory that we have been working.
Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and then we will be clustering them for opening the floor for responding.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Joaquín, Jocelyn, Angela, and Sahara. This has been very inspiring. All the different realities that you brought us today to think about how we plan and how we build space and how we engage with spatial practices, I think are very important. And as Catalina mentioned, those are the types of realities that we need to think of today when we think about our futures. So I'm going to bring together just some of the elements that I found very, that are kind of a common thread, and that I find that very important to help us think about what is next in terms of our built environment professionals, and think how we address the current realities and the current crisis. So the four of you talk about memory, identity. The four of you discuss the different practices that have been oppressive, either historically or current practices of oppression that has caused and still cause harm for the territories as well as the populations that have in these territories. But I really like that the four of you talk about despite these practices, despite the harm and the violence. All of you recognize the role of memory in that idea of despite, like there are practices that are being imposed, but despite of those practices, there are memories of different ways of doing, different ways of living, and different ways of understanding our relationship with the land, with the territory. You also talk about against, and that idea of against brings the notion of agency, is how do we use that memory, and how do we, those practices or strategies of despite become something that we can use to transform. And all of you also engage with the beyond, which brings the radical imaginations and thinking about different futures. So I think that those concepts, that despite, against, and beyond, are really powerful in trying to help us build that notion of healing strategies, but also pedagogies and methods that help us deal with the continued continuous violence that we live today in our territories. So I'm going to leave it there to give some space for questions and answers. But thank you so much. It was very inspiring, and I think that's been fantastic.
I think we have witnessed a very interesting set of reflections, and this for us is becoming kind of our agenda of work, and we are going to be persistent in bringing this reparative angle to rethink the urban and to engage not only in scholarship but also in practice and activism as well. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you in the in-person session that will start in half an hour. Thank you. Bye.